Good evening, everyone. We have a program to follow this evening. Thank you for being so responsive. Welcome. My name is Amanda Lahikainen, and I'm the executive director here at the Algonquin Museum of American Art. A lot of you know that, but we are filming today for posterity, so it's good to give a formal introduction. We are all excited and honored to have David Breslin speak here today. And one of the reasons we know that is because we have over 150 people in this building right now, which I think is some sort of a record, David. So I'd like to pose a question: why now? And by that I mean, why invite David Breslin here today? Now the first answer is the obvious one, in that really any day would be a good day to invite you. And we know that. But there are two other reasons that I'd like to really highlight. One is that today we are launching an inaugural lecture series, Distinctive Voices in American Art. And we wanted a speaker befitting that honor. So this lecture series is designed to do many, many things in the years to come. Among them, to bring a deep level of scholarship to our community, to help us engage more national conversations in modern and contemporary art, to better connect OMAA's practices, exhibitions, and programming to what other curators, scholars, academics, one more, artists are doing, and what they're thinking and writing about. But we also want to provide access to people and ideas that might otherwise be difficult to encounter here in Southern Maine. And then the last one, and I think this is really important, I think we all want to learn new things, right? And so Distinctive Voices in American Art is designed to do all of these things. And this lecture series is part of our strategic plan, and it marks a really important step forward for this organization. So we are extremely grateful to a number of individuals who have enabled this to happen. I'm going to start with Carol and Noel Leary, who are right here on the front. Thank you for making this lecture possible today. Yeah. I'd also like to thank our season sponsors, Tom and Fotine Cote, and especially these two gentlemen right here, Tom Keys and Keith Fox. Thank you for your guidance, your insights, and your support of our programming. So the second answer to this question, why invite David Breslin to speak today, is that not only do we get to gain some insight into his curatorial practice, but we also get to learn what's happening at the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now. As many of you know, there is a new Tang wing for modern and contemporary art it was recently unveiled, and it is set to open in 2030. So many of you know David has tremendous experience with the most prominent art institutions really there are in this country, the Whitney, the Clark Art Institute, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. One of the artists I'm very eager to hear him speak about today is Jenny Holzer. Not only did David write his dissertation on this artist, but he also spent nearly a decade working in her studio. So I'm mentioning that because I know he's going to mention her today. David is known for collaborating across various artistic disciplines and areas. One good example of this is perhaps the fact that he co-chaired the Indigenous Artists Working Group at the Whitney. Another example of this collaboration is his work with Frida Escobedo in designing the new wing for the department that he oversees. So the Tang wing, I understand, but I'm going to ask David to talk more about it, is 70,000 square feet of exhibition space for art, and it will house a refreshed presentation of their collection of modern and contemporary art. Now, Frida Escobedo is an artist's architect based in New York City and Mexico City, and she's doing some really compelling things with this design for the new building. She's expanding narratives. She's promoting interconnected histories of global art. And she's helping to collapse this difference between the local and the global. She draws upon very diverse references, from Annie Albers on the one side to Chan Chan, the Peruvian capital that really starts in the 10th century CE down in South America. So really diverse references. And there is a line, as I understand it, but you will clarify, there is a limestone lattice that really evokes a strong sense of materiality, which is just fascinating to me. There are two articles that I recommend. Robin Poggraben wrote in the New York Times. There was one in January and another in April. So I highly recommend that you kind of look into this yourself. But to quote loosely one of her articles, Escobedo's work is about connectivity across regions, across disciplines, and across civilizations. And to me, that's really exciting, really, really exciting work. So my hope for you this evening is that you learn about this new project and its curatorial possibilities and get inspired. So it's about inspiration. As many of you know, we are working on a new campus plan here with Kevin Daly Architects, and it's been really instructive for all of us here on the team at OMAA to watch with great interest what's happening in New York. So I'm eager for everyone to gain insight into how transformative architecture and thoughtful design can be for a community and for the life of an art museum. So I'd like to end by thanking Maura Harrington. Tonight's lecture expands our educational programming, and thanks to a recent transformational gift by Maura, we have a solid foundation for continuing this impactful programming into the future. This moment, I'd like to invite Devin Zimmerman, our curator of modern contemporary art, to further introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, and just echoing your gratitude, I want to repeat thanks to Carol and Noel Leary, as well as Tom Keyes and Keith Fox, whose generous support made this evening possible. It is my great pleasure to introduce David Breslin, the Leonard A. Lauder Curator in charge of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. David's accomplishments are as long as his title, so I'm going to be as brief as possible. David earned his bachelor's degree in English from Amherst College, a master's in art history from Williams College, and a PhD in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University. Following his studies, he served as the Associate Director of Research and Academic Programming and Associate Curator of Contemporary Projects at the Clark Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Following his time at the Clark, he took a position of Chief Curator of the Drawing Institute at the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas, spearheading a dynamic program of exhibitions and public and scholarly events, while helping to shape the design of the Institute's new facility and fellowship program. In 2016, he then took a position at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where he served as curator and director of the collections, and then the DeMartini family curator and director of curatorial initiatives. During this time, he curated and co-curated numerous exhibitions, including the landmark retrospective David Wojnarowicz, History Keeps Me Awake at Night, and the acclaimed 2022 Whitney Biennial, Quiet as It's Kept, co-curated with Adrian Edwards. He now takes on the once-in-a-generation transformational reimagining of the Modern and Contemporary Art Department at the Met through the construction of the forthcoming Oscar L. and H.M. Agnes Shu Tang Wing for Modern and Contemporary Art. With the crowd here tonight, all I ask is that David bring a few square feet next time he comes to speak at the museum. His lecture tonight is entitled, Who Cares About American Art? So please give a round of applause for David Breslin.
Thanks so much, Amanda and Devin. I'm really honored to be here. I'm also very intimidated to have to present with this behind me and with Nicole's paintings in the room. I'm very grateful to Carol and Noel as well for sponsoring this great lecture, and to my very dear friends, Keith and Tom, for having us. My dear wife, Emily, and Grace are here. I wanted to start with this fairly provocative title, Who Cares About American Art? mostly to get you to come. So thank you, and have a good evening. Enjoy your cocktails. But I really wanted to do it because the question of what American art means, I think, is something that any of us who care about art think about all the time, particularly at a museum such as the Algonquin Museum of American Art, where it's part of your identity and mission. I worked at the Whitney Museum of American Art for 6 years, and that was a question that we got all the time. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a museum of American art? And we took that very seriously. And for me, the most important thing about it was you were not a museum of the United States. You could use American as an adjective. And I think each of us in this room, regardless of our political beliefs, our ideological leanings, who we voted for, has words that you associate with America or American. Openness, possibility, frustration, dreams. And that's something that I think we really can lean into when we think about what American art means. So if you ask me who cares, we all care. And we care because there's no escaping the condition of the United States being the most powerful nation in the world. So like it or not, people look at us and look at this country and what we do. And I feel like art, if you want to think about it through a quote by Andy Warhol that the Velvet Underground memorably worked through, I'll be your mirror. Art does that in ways that sometimes we don't like, that sometimes we're frustrated by, but I think American artists really in this pervasive way show us things about us and what we can be that we might not always want to tell ourselves, or when we do, we're challenged by it, we're provoked by it, we want to know more. So tonight, I've decided to do something that's hopefully a little bit like the country art itself, part strategic, part improvisation. Thank you, Grace. Yeah. The strategic element, we know this as a country. We do great things when we set our mind to it. The Marshall Plan. We do incredible things when we improvise, jazz, abstract expressionism, hip hop. So I'm going to try to bring the two together, and I'm going to do two things with this talk. I'm going to quickly go through almost an exhibition that I have in my head about where we are as a culture right now. And this is almost like a mood board of artworks that I love, and just kind of talk through some of those works. For those of us who live with art, other people live with songs or with plays, those images flash through our head all the time. I was driving up last night with Emily and Grace, thinking about what else could be in the slideshow. So this is a very incomplete list of things. I won't tell you how many they are, so you're not counting, so you know how quickly you'll get out of here. And then the second part of what I'll do is really give a quick overview, and maybe for some conversation afterwards, of the Tang Wing project that Amanda mentioned. So how can I have to talk about Morrison Hartley when I come to Maine? I'm very lucky that in my office, I don't have this painting, but I have another Morrison Hartley painting of Mount Katahdin. Hartley, for me, is an artist that when I think about the American experience, shows that American experience premised on how do we bridge the local and the international. This is an incredible work that he made after time in Berlin. He's synthesizing so many influences. The revolution of Cubism, how do we see the world when technology and World War has kind of shattered the idea of a unified self, and German Expressionism. He's there in Berlin when this idea of a new personally motivated art is really coming through. So it's art historical, it's international, but it's also deeply personal. Portrait of a German Officer is really about someone that he loved, Karl von Freiberg, who died in World War I. There are incredible references within this painting. 24, how old he was when he died. Number 4, the regiment that he served in. The Iron Cross, something that he won posthumously for his service. And then his initials on the bottom left. So for me, this idea of what American means is always deeply personal and deeply riven with this situation. When you think about this time that he's making this work, not yet, but Germany is the enemy. So how do we love our enemy? How do we think with our enemy? How do we get beyond our ideological boundaries? And for me, this really opens up a tension in what art can be and what art can actually implement and open up as a situation where we think more broadly about what our human condition is. A lot of these paintings are in the Met's collection. This is a painting I absolutely love. It's called Sleepers from 1943 by Horace Pippin. And it's at this time that Pippin, he's older, he'll die 2 years later. He's an artist that many of you probably know, a self-taught African-American artist who spent much of his life outside of Philadelphia. But at this time, he's doing two things. He's making paintings about John Brown, and he's making paintings that recall his childhood in Goshen, New York. So in these paintings, they're frequently his mother and himself as a child. And these are loving scenes, but they're also ones that show that the condition is not one that's where everything is perfect. The house is falling apart, there are these bare walls, the blanket used to cover them is something that the mother made. Bye, Grace, have a good evening. Only 2 down. I also love this idea that it was never a condition of being an accepted artist by where you went to school, who you trained with. That was something that was fought for by a number of artists, but that you could forge your own path and identity. Not easily, but that you could. And that there are great gallerists like Edith Halpert in New York who would show artists like Horace Pippin in the 1940s, before the Civil Rights Movement, who could create a new idea of what American art can and should be. But I also love that this painting is premised on love, of domesticity, of personality, of interiority, and that this idea, even today, of what that could mean is very important. Very different painting, Autumn Rhythm by Jackson Pollock. I have a pleasure of working on an exhibition that's looking at Lee Krasner, and I've been thinking a lot about Devin's great show that was here a few years ago. We're working on a Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock show. And for me, what Jackson Pollock did was not so much that he broke from European modernism, but that he brought American regionalism and he brought Mexican muralism and modernism along with him. So this overall painting, which seemed like a complete break from anything that's happened before, was something that he saw inspiration from the Hopi Native Americans and sand drawings, or that he was really thinking at that scale because of what the Mexican muralists were able to do. So this idea, not necessarily that you need to break away from everything that came before, but that you can really make something new with what came with you. And I think that radical vision, this idea that you could forge a new path with new means, but not abandon what came before you, I think is also something that's fundamental about an American art history. That it's changing, it's evolving, it's metabolizing, but you're always bringing what you had with you. And I think that idea of knowing that in some ways you're a line along a path is also very important in a very young country with a very young art history, to think about those paths of continuity. Just 5 years later, which I think is almost radical to think that Jasper Johns made the white flag painting just that number of years after the radicality of Jackson Pollock. And I think many of you know what I think is kind of the greatest, almost apocryphal story. When asked how he came about the idea of the American flag, he said, "It came to me in a dream." Or it came to him from a drive, or it came to him from seeing it on his front lawn, or in every place that you might see an American flag. And the other idea that I think is remarkable is that he said he went to things like flags and targets and numbers because they're things that the mind already knows, so that you could pay more attention to the painting itself. But we can't get away from what the flag means and what it stands for. And I'm sure many of you in this room, like I do, when I look at this painting in the Met's collection, I'm superimposing red and white and blue on top of those passages. So he's bringing to this painting the things that we already have within us. We don't come to artworks with as empty ciphers. We bring everything that we have to them. I mean, when I came into this gallery and seeing Nicole's work, I'm coming with an idea of other paintings by her that I have seen, other vistas that may or may not look like this, of knowing her. And I think if we forget that we don't bring ourselves to every artwork we encounter, we lose what's so great about the art experiences, which is that we are a part of it. We are the viewers that make this thing happen. Whenever I give a tour of this painting at the Met, people always ask me what I see, and I just quickly fire back, well, no, what do you see? And one really young high school kid gave the most perceptive response. It was, it's almost like a blank projection screen. And I thought that was so thoughtful that you could see this thing that was made to be present in space. It doesn't small, it doesn't retreat, it's this large looming presence, but that was made slowly and with care so that I can see what I want in it and I can make new ideas from it. And I think that idea of openness and possibility is something that's a kind of a foundational principle of this country, and it's also foundational to how people think about artwork and how it was made. I've gone on a very dark path with this presentation. It's not indicative of anything in the air these days. But when I was thinking about this presentation, I was almost wanting to make a show. I was almost thinking about this talk as a gallery talk in one room in space, and how I would talk about these different ideas that are in some ways bringing me some kind of idea of where we came from so I can get some kind of hand on where we're going. But I think many of you know this very iconic series of paintings that Andy Warhol made. This is a little electric chair. He started making these in 1963, soon after capital punishment was abolished in New York State. He would later, in the late 60s, make these at a very large scale. But I love these smaller ones because they have silence, this small text that would light up as soon as they were about to flip the switch. When he made those larger paintings, they were cropped, and the focus was just on the electric chair. So the thing that's most interesting to me about this work is that in this painting, you see something that you usually don't. You might read about an electrocution, you might have your ideas about what capital punishment is, but you probably haven't been in that room. So the idea of actually laying bare what this situation looks like, I think, is a revelation to people, that a room like that exists, that these things are tangible, that art can have a function of serving as a community set of eyes. But what I love with this smaller version with silence there is that there are other people in that room who have to be told to be silent when that thing was to happen. So this idea of a certain kind of voyeurism, or the expectation that we're all watching and witnessing, I don't think it's foundational to American art, but I think it's something that American artists have done extremely well, is to think about the conditions of spectatorship, and that we're all a part of this condition. It's a little bit how I think about the Jasper Johns and that smart high school kid talking about this being an idea of a projection. We are witnessing other people witness, and the artist is helping us be part of the scene we may not have the opportunity to be a part of. I'm going from very large works to some that are really intimate. This is an artist that I love, Nancy Spiro, an artist who was very involved in different radical causes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this is one that she did during the height of the American War in Vietnam, called Kill Commies Maypole. And this I love, of the mashing together of one thing that we find completely joyful, the maypole used for fun and games, rites of spring, and then what are on these, are being played on the maypole, but heads, decapitated heads. So this idea that I think is really incredible, grotesque, yes, gruesome, yes, but the idea that this becomes foundational to a way of life. The maypole comes out every spring. It celebrates every year something new happening. And in some ways, this one small drawing brings out the cyclicality of violence. Not maybe one event, but how this recurs and recurs and occurs, and how the activity of pushing that head around is something that is too known and too familiar. And I love that she does this in this little drawing, and that not everything has to be this massive scale to do that. This is a painting that's very happy for me and my colleagues. It's now a promised gift for the Metropolitan Museum. It's called The Studio by Philip Guston from 1969. Guston, I think as many of you know, came to using the figure of the Klansman very early on. He was a teenager in Los Angeles. He had memories of Klansmen and jalopies going through, terrorizing the community. And he came to this later, again, after he had a career of being an abstract expressionist, being known for his abstract works, and then wanted to come back to figuration because he thought that this was something other people could relate to. And he had this incredible quote during the height of the civil rights movement, during the war in Vietnam, and he says, "What kind of man am I when the war is going on, when people are doing things on the street, want them adjusting a red or a green. Now, I don't agree with that because I think people adjusting red and green in a studio can do something very personal about what it means to be an individual, what subjectivity means. But I think in that moment, the power of saying, I want to stand up and do something with my work was incredibly revelatory. I mean, he lost friends because of this. His best friend, the musician Morton Feldman, never spoke to him again when he had the show at the Marlborough Gallery. But I think what's incredible about this is that he didn't just make a picture of a Klansman. He made a self-portrait of himself wearing that mask. Here he is as a Jewish man. Here he is as someone who wanted to think both about what was happening in the country, but almost how he felt like he needed to identify with that thing in order to actually make it more intelligible to the people that he was thinking with or working with, and how he almost needed to see what evil looked like in order to explain what it was like. This is also kind of a crazy, goofy painting. It looks like a cartoon. It's not all serious. He also, I think, wanted to deflate the high seriousness that I think the Klansman wanted to have everyone think and take seriously. It's deflated. He has his cigarette. He's making a painting of himself. So this self-reflexive idea, the idea that you almost need to inhabit the positions of so many other people before you come on out of the other side and really know what you think, I think is particularly resonant in this moment when so many people are drawn on ideological grounds, where we repeat sound bites that we hear from others. The idea of having to think for oneself or act for oneself, to put oneself in someone else's shoes, I think is brilliantly materialized in this painting. Here is someone who couldn't have been more different in how he made work. This is the great Washington, D.C.-based painter Sam Gilliam. And Gilliam, as opposed to Guston, never left abstraction. For him, abstraction was the way of being completely radical, of inhabiting space and holding space. Sam Gilliam was someone who knew the work of people like Helen Frankenthaler and Kenneth Noland and Morris Louis, other very important painters in Washington, D.C. But what he did was something very different. Even though this is a photograph of him in his studio, what's important is that he took the painting, the abstract painting, off the wall. And he created almost these paintings in space, these drapes, folded, layered works, where in some ways the painting is there and important and central, but what we do, almost creating a forum for us to act in and be together, is so much of what's animating that work. And he did this work, obviously in the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 68, 69, and 70. And the radicality for him as a person to take the work off the stretcher was also a way to say the gallery doesn't have to be the way that you think it needs to look. It doesn't need to be a white cube. The painting doesn't need to be on the wall. Things can be different. Possibility is there. Radicality is present, but you just have to do it. And I think that's one of the great lessons of this work. It's also work that when you install it, you have some freedom. It's nerve-wracking. He and another artist, the great Nigerian artist Ellen Atsui, are very much alike this way. You get the work, there's kind of an idea how it looks like, but then they say, now you do the rest. I don't think you ever realize how hard freedom is until someone says, do it, but don't mess it up. And it can go so badly, and it has, I've installed a couple of these works and it's gone so poorly. But that idea that you, in a different way, are brought into how this work is made, I think is so important for this idea that the audience isn't just a passive receiver, but so active in the making of art. This, in terms of a mouthpiece for how work can function and bring, in this case, the war home, is an incredible work that was done in 1970 by the Art Workers Coalition. It's a photograph from the My Lai massacre. And the question was asked if there were babies who were involved in this massacre, and the answer is, and babies, the question, and babies, and the answer was, and babies. So for me, the power of this artwork is also the power to confront. This is not an artwork that is passive. It's a part of a protest movement. And some may recoil from this. It's a bloody image. I don't even want to look at it. I feel bad for subjecting you to this when you could look at something else in this room. But I love this idea, and the important idea, that a coalition of artists thought that this was an image that one needed to see to be able to assess how one felt about a war that was being done in so many people's name. And I think that power of this work, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, echoes in different movements around the AIDS crisis, for example, where the idea of having to make a pointed image with people's short attention spans never was more important. If you can see, my brain went in very different places when putting this together. I wanted to have this almost back and forth dialectical relationship between the necessity of having these types of work exist in the world and almost exist at the same time. So to imagine that the Art Workers Coalition was making that impossibly difficult work next to a piece, or this environment that Rothko made that opened in Houston in 1971, I think shows the importance of having a really capacious idea of what art is and what it can do. There's confrontation, and then there's also a place for solace or another kind of heightened presence that I think only art can afford and can bring to you. So this kind of balancing act that an artist can make between being so directly in your face that you want to look away, and then in Rothko's case, so seductive that you just want to be a part of. And for me, the lesson of the Rothko Chapel, I was lucky to work in that neighborhood for a couple of years, and I would go there for lunch 3 times a week. Wasn't that you were necessarily magnetized by these works. It was almost like a weak magnetic pull, that you would go to one, kind of fall off, and go to another one. But what you were aware of was that of all the other things that you weren't doing, you weren't on your phone. You weren't so much thinking about the problems that you brought to this, or what you had just read in the newspaper, or that really annoying email your boss just sent you. You were heightened in the conditions that a painting allowed you to be elsewhere, somewhere else. In this case, it could have been away from the war in Vietnam in 1971, or it could be away from something else that's happened in your personal life. But this kind of dynamic that art has to change and hit you and do something differently to you. And this is why I feel very lucky to be a curator, because I get to inhabit all of these artists' brains at a certain moment. Nicole, I don't know how an artist can live with being in your own brain all the time, because that ferocity of attention is incredible, but also there are escapes, right? I mean, there's the necessity to get away and think differently. And I think in some ways it's toggling between these different registers. It's kind of an incredible way that museums like this can afford when you go from one gallery and have one show like Nicole's, and then go to another gallery, the permanent collection, and have a completely different relationship within 25 feet of how so many different individuals come to know what the world is and how they relate to it. This is kind of a layered project. These are 2 photographs that Alvin Baltrop took of Gordon Matta Clark's Days End project. This is a pier on the west side of Manhattan and the Hudson River that Gordon Matta Clark saw was empty, and he was someone who was very interested in these ideas of site specificity in place. He knew that no one was really going to cause a fuss if he came in and cut a huge hole in the wall into it. And he called this a cathedral of sun, light, and water. So this is the cut on the right, and on the left, this is kind of the amplification of light that would come and set this glow. Alvin Baltrop is another artist who was very interested in this site because it had this exact pier had a long history of being a place where queer people, particularly gay men, hung out, had sex, met, sunbathed, called it their own. And if you can see on the right image, these are a group of guys just hanging out and sunbathing. So the idea that this artwork had purchase on a number of people's daily lives, that this was a work that wasn't just made for photographs, for posterity, but had a very direct audience, I find to be very interesting. I also think that Gordon Matta Clark, who studied architecture, also knew that cities change dramatically. And I'll get to an image later what this place looks like now. But the idea to do something in a place so that the audience could be a few hundred people, but that could mean a lot. That could mean something very specific, that you don't need to make an artwork that has to be seen or is estimated to be seen by millions or is on Instagram being recirculated, but can have a public of 10, 20, 30, that art can be made for a certain community and set of individuals, I think is extremely important. I wanted to show this work, and this is a group of works that I'm thinking about that have to do with the AIDS crisis. It's kind of an echo to some of those works from the era of the Vietnam War. This is by a great artist named Donald Moffat, and this is a poster that he made called He Kills Me, with Donald's kind of mordant humor. He kind of is in some ways thinking about that phrase when someone's, well, what do you think about that guy? He kills me, as if he's so funny, right? That he cracks me up, he kills me. But in this case, what he's drawing attention to is that Reagan, after having been in office for 7 years, only at that point says the word AIDS. So what Moffat wanted to do, along with other artists who were deeply involved in Grand Fury and ACT UP, these activist group, was wanted to get these messages out on the street. So this was an artwork, but it was also really a direct address. These were posters that were pasted that you could see all over Manhattan, San Francisco, Chicago, and other major cities. And very pointedly, you don't know who the bullseye is in reference to. Is it to the citizens who are under threat? Is it to Reagan himself? And I think that ambiguity, this tension, is, I think, very key to that work, but also key to this idea that, as opposed to the Rothko Chapel, with that, which is about, in some ways, a very specific kind of personalized attention, this is for a mass address. This is for public dissemination. This is, in some ways, how many people can see this, react to it, and feel differently after having seen this image. This is, for me, one of the most haunting artworks of all time. It's by the artist David Wojnarowicz that I worked on an exhibition a number of years ago now, who also was very involved in the AIDS crisis. But in some ways, instead of taking this kind of agitprop, propagandistic approach of making work, he went in this image to a more poetic form of working. This was a diorama that was at the Natural History Museum in New York City. What it's actually showing, and you don't see all of it, is an indigenous practice of hunting where the buffalo are rounded up, and instead of killing them with a bow and arrow, they fall off the cliff. And so for him, seeing how many of his friends were dying, this idea that you were really being led to your fall, almost being pushed off of it, that you didn't even need to be taken out by a gun or a weapon, but it was just in some ways the indifference or the callous indifference of those who were around you that could make this happen. So in some ways, this kind of searing indictment of the culture that he was in was done by this most poetic means of simply going in, seeing this thing there, taking a photograph of it, and proceeding somewhere else. And there's a poetry to this work, there's a non-didacticism to this work, which I think makes it so timely now, that you could in some ways bring so many feelings and associations that are obviously embedded within that history, but aren't stuck in that moment in time. There's this recurrence of symbolism and ideas that I also think plays out across different artistic cultures, but I think is extremely resonant within American culture. This idea that we're replaying images, that history is never dead, but just being resurrected and rethought and reimagined anew. This is a work called Oozwald by Katie Nolan. It's from 1989, and it's this incredible image right when Lee Harvey Oswald is shot by Jack Ruby 2 days after JFK is assassinated. This is about my size. It's leaning. There are these holes in the work suggesting where the shots could go. There's an American flag stuffed into Lee Harvey Oswald's mouth, and it's a scene of direct confrontation. Now, why is an artist in 1989 revisiting the 60s? And I think this is something that we see with a number of these artists, this idea of going back to the past and revisiting these images, because I think in some ways this idea that there was a conspiracy, right? This is something that has come up in culture now, that there must have been something else happening, that there must have been another shooter, that it couldn't just be Lee Harvey Oswald, that conspiracy is so much a part of how this culture thinks and how our culture motivates and how rumor circulates and becomes part of what history can be and is told. So in some ways, she brings this into the room, this idea of rumor and confrontation and also conspiracy. So I think this idea that we think that today we're living in a time when conspiracy is rampant, this is sometimes like the product of the culture at large and the product of the culture that we live in right now. So this is an incredibly indelible work, and the idea that the flag also is part of, in some way, stymieing what this person can say or how he can speak, I think is extremely telling, especially when you think about how the flag has been used by other artists, including Jasper Johns. This moment, 1989, you see there are certain times that I'm leaning into, is a very productive time, because I think that in times of crisis, you see artists really needing to push how their works can be manifested. This is a work, a series of works by Jenny Holzer called the Lament Series. This was an installation at the Dia Art Foundation in 1989. And you would walk into this extremely dark room with 13 vertical LED signs displaying text. And then on the ground, as you saw in the first image, were these marble sarcophagi. And embedded within those sarcophagi and those texts are the statements of 13 people, 10 adults and 3 children, talking about their dreams, aspirations, what they have done, what they had wished to do. Now, again, like the David Wojnarowicz exhibition work that I showed, this work is haunted by the AIDS crisis and the idea that you, as a very young person, could be struck down. So to enter this room, almost a room of communal mourning, the exhibition in some ways took lessons from the Rothko Chapel, that you needed to create a set of conditions for people to be together, to respond, so that one could have an individual response. But she took it one step further by having these different texts, in some ways very specifically address an individual's response, how they felt, how they cared, what they wanted to do. What I find remarkable about this work now is that even though it's so thought about within that time, it's timeless. It's in some ways, if you can be extremely specific about a work, and I think about this, if I think about a Morrison Hartley Mount Katahdin painting, if I paint that Mount Katahdin painting so much that it feels like only that artist could have done it, the viewer feels like he or she knows that painting because of the specific address that the artist brings. So it's almost more universal by the specificity that the artist brings to that. And I think this is very much alive in Holzer's work, that you read it now and it can be about so many scenarios going from the present moment to an even deeper past. And also the use of stone itself, this marble, something that's timeless, that will last beyond us, paired with what was then this new technology of the LED sign, this mashing together of histories and modes of address to reach different viewers. Maybe the kid who wants to look at the LED sign and someone else who's more attentive to what that marble might read. Again, this is a work from 1991 that's dealing with so many of the same issues, but dealt with in a very different way. This is an artist named Felix Gonzalez Torres. This is entitled Untitled Portrait of Ross in LA. It's from 1991. Many of you might have seen works by Gonzalez Torres before, but it's a pile of candy sat in a corner or on the ground. The ICA has a great piece, exactly. And the only instructions for this work are that the ideal weight is 175 pounds. And you can take the work, you can take the pieces of candy, you can do whatever you want with it. You can take a handful, you can take one, you can eat it, you can give it away. You can take the candy off the wall and put it on the ground and make your name out of it. But at the end of the day, it's reconstituted to 175 pounds, set in the corner. Now, Gonzalez Torres was someone who's very interested in the history of minimalism. That's something very simple, like a Dan Flavin LED tube, or a neon tube, or Carl Andre set of metal plates on the floor. You could feel something. Your brain might not know what it is, but your body feels it first. And Gonzalez Torres takes this one more step further by being something that you can incorporate and take into your body. Now, does it mean something to me that in some ways that 175 pounds refers to the ideal weight of his partner before he was sick from HIV? Yes. I mean, that idea that there's this personal reference to that work, even going back to the Morrison Hartley, that embedded within this abstract thing is this story of about a person and something experienced and something that was loved and something that was lost is important to that work. But there's also something about not knowing what that refers to. This idea of responsibility, that when you take something, you're creating work for someone else. Someone needs to refill that at the end of the day. If you drop it on the ground, someone needs to clean that up. So that idea of an artwork having some kind of agency and openness and possibility, that it can change, that ownership can mean something differently than what we think about it to be, I think is extremely meaningful about this work. This is an installation by Robert Gober, untitled, that was also at the DR Foundation in 1992. It's now at the Glenstone Museum in Potomac, Maryland. And if you have a chance to be there, it has these same kind of beautiful conditions that this museum has of being both an indoor and outdoor museum. But this is an incredible moving installation where he worked with these commercial sign painters and mural makers to make these wooden backgrounds, this wooded background. And then there's these, on top, these prison bars with this soft glow, almost as if you were inside this room and could only see the sunset at all times, but at least you had the sunset. And then these sinks that are flowing and running. Again, this was the same period that Felix Gonzalez Torres was working, that Jenny Holzer was working. And what was important for Gober at this moment was that he turned this water on, that there was a place for hope in the work. He had made work for about 5 or 10 years before that, where all these fountains were turned off. They were inert, they were dead. They were fountains that looked like a smiling face or that looked like a tomb. But in this space, he said he wanted to be something where one could feel a sense of renewal, rebirth, life, almost like a baptism. So this idea that, and I think it's a very optimistic idea, that art can do all those things, that optimism, even during a very dark, bleak moment, can be part of what the artwork brings, is very powerful and alive in the work. Dana Schutz, this incredible work called Presentation from 2005. When I see it, there's so many, I'm sure when you see it as well, especially anyone who grew up in the Philadelphia area, you think of Thomas Eakins' Gross Clinic. You think of these incredible histories of painting, again, that both memorialize and celebrate things that everyone else can't see, like an autopsy in the Eakins painting. In this work, done to almost incredibly hilarious effect, this large body splayed out with this group of onlookers seeing what the doctor is doing. And for me, even though I was at first drawn to what was happening in the foreground, I think the painting is really about the background and the different ways of acting and seeing and looking at other people. I don't think it's any surprise that the etymology of the word autopsy means to see with one's own eyes. So this idea that we are so immersed in the idea of being a spectator, of wanting to see for ourselves, of someone being part of a scene, no matter how gruesome it could be. And I think that's in some ways an incredible lesson that Dana Schutz learned from someone like Philip Guston, that you put hard things out there, you soften it by a certain approach, the way color is used, that it's in some ways made more palatable, but it doesn't deny the toughness of the scene or the toughness of what's at work. And I also love this kind of elliptical nature that she's thinking about Thomas Eakins as she's thinking about Philip Guston, but making it very new for the culture that she's a part of at that moment, which is also the culture of celebrity magazines and TMZ. She made a painting in this exact same year of Michael Jackson's autopsy, even when Michael Jackson is still alive. So this idea of really wanting to plumb this idea of what does it mean to be a culture of lookers, to be a culture of spectators, and hopefully not a culture of scavengers, but to be there, to be in that room. Just the next year, and this is what I also love about artwork in this country, the variety, the different ways of working, the different possibilities. This is a work by Charles Ray called The New Beetle from 2006. It's bronze that he's painted white, almost this ineffable glowing thing that feels lighter than it actually is. It sits on the floor, there's no stanchion. When you get up close to it, it's almost as if you can see the rib on his side breathing. But this idea of new life and possibility is something that he pairs with what he calls the work The New Beetle, when this car was still new, when something old was made again, when something that seemed to be a vintage idea was brought back into culture. But when you approach this artwork, it's almost like it's in the room with you. And this is when I say that rib, because when Charles Ray, the artist, speaks about this, it's almost as if this thing is animate with you, that the spirit, the breath of the artwork is part of what we're looking at. And I think that's also, for me, so poignant and powerful about our relationship with artwork, is that if we see these things as other entities that have a life, that have a spirit, that they're bringing themselves to you as we bring ourselves to them, I think is also extremely powerful. Also, it's rare to see depictions of childhood, I think, as much as there could be in artwork. This idea of something made new that's changing and adapting. This is the son of a good friend of the artist. And this idea that he will then track how this child grows up, how he changes, is also something where the culture of the new beetle, that man-made material thing, is brought then to this timeless thing, which is childhood that's constantly changing and evolving. This is along that theme, and this is a very impressionistic exhibition that I've mentally put together to talk about tonight. This is a work by Carissa Rodriguez called The Maid. This is a project where she decided to follow in 3 different homes what you see in the foreground, which is the Sherry Levine sculpture called The Newborn, which itself is a riff on the Constantine Brancusi sculpture. What she wanted to do was go into each of those spaces. One's a museum, one's a domestic space in New York, and one's a domestic space in California, and see how people interact with the artwork. And for me, when you see this work, it's very haunting, because in one, you see a conservator very lovingly caressing the work with gloves, as the careful museum professional does. And then in the home, you see someone who works in a domestic capacity with a brush dusting it. And in some ways, it very much personalizes the idea of what an artwork is and how much it changes based on how we live with it. A painting of Nicole's is different when we see it here than we would see it in Chicago or New York. And I love this idea of personalizing these experiences of what an artwork could be and what it means. But Carissa was also someone who was attempting to become pregnant at the time when she was making this work as well. So the idea of following around a work called Newborn, where this idea of care and responsibility is brought to an artwork, was also very powerful to her as something that you are bringing and coaxing this thing into the world, and you're bringing everything that you can along with it to make it new. And it's a haunting work. It's a beautiful work. We have it on view at the Met. And it's also interesting how other works, in some ways, rally around it or hide behind it. In this one home, there's this great Andy Warhol portrait, but it becomes almost like another witness to the artwork. So this idea of witnessing and being present with the work, I think, is a theme that you see throughout this presentation. This is what's now currently at the site of that Gordon Matta Clark, Alvin Boutrout project that I described earlier. This is a work called Day's End by an artist named David Hammonds, who was invited by the Whitney Museum to do a project, any project. He was invited to come into the galleries, looked at that huge 5th floor where you could do almost anything you wanted to do, and said, thank you for the invitation, and then pointed outside and said, what about something out there? He knew that Gordon Matta Clark had done a project called Days End, and what he wanted to do there was in some ways recreate to the exact scale of that project what that pier was before he worked on it. So it's almost like a ghost monument to Gordon Matta Clark, but also a monument to another New York, to another past, to the other people who were there and inhabited, and also a monument to all that was happening and changing in that neighborhood. And I think what's powerful about the work, too, is that it is a ghost. It's a structure that doesn't have a roof or walls. So when you go and you see it and you stay with it, as I'm sure some of you have done, it also feels like it's a clearinghouse for emotions and memory and feelings and spirits. It's almost, to me, like a contemporary version of the white flag, a set of projections that you bring to the artwork. I only have a couple left before I go to our questions. This is a painting by Nicole Eisman called Abolitionists in the Park. Again, incredible artwork made in 2022. And this was the period of Occupy Wall Street, I think as many people remember in New York. This was at City Hall, but she transposes it and almost makes it into her version of Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or a different kind of Manet painting of a typical scene of lunching or frolicking in a garden. And for her, this idea of bringing this past history, if you come to it and the Met, you've seen a Manet painting, and you look at this, that history is brought with it. But it's also alive with her present. These are her friends who are there in the artwork. I know some of these people personally who are part of the work itself. So the idea that there's an idea of a contemporary history painting, that mode of thinking and working isn't dead but alive today. And I think this idea that painting and artwork has a responsibility to record the things of our time, to make them present, palpable to different viewers, so that they become both documents of a moment, but then also a mythology. A curator 25 years from now, who isn't me, will be giving a tour of those galleries and seeing people who maybe history will only know, but the people personally don't. And I think in some ways it's such an energizing way whenever we walk through our museums that the people depicted, the scenes that are there that might not exist, someone knew those things, someone knew those people, that these are all personal experiences and exchanges. They may not be our own, but there's someone else who have embodied them. This is an image that Louise Lauder took when there was a Jasper Johns retrospective at the Whitney Museum a number of years ago. And what she wanted to do at this moment was take this blurred photograph where she captured it by, on her camera, having the shutter speed wide open and moving her camera at the same time. So this idea of the photograph being something that's a document of a place and a thing, an idea, but also more getting to the feeling of this idea and a time. And I think for me, and this is the last two images that I'll close with, this idea of what position are we in when we're looking at these works? Are we the object itself that's being looked at, static, projected upon, or in some ways, are we the empathetic viewer who's in some ways bringing our feelings and emotions to those things that we see in that moment? That flag is not being a static idea itself, but one that takes on meaning based on who we are and what we're doing at that time. The last work, and it's the only one that's out of chronology, is part of a video by Alex DeCourte. He is dressed himself as Frankenstein's monster. This is a work that he made over a number of years. He's a great dancer, great performer, great makeup artist too. But for me, when I think about this work now, it's interesting to think about in what ways you can think about this work as bringing forward the idea of what American means. Is it the monster that was brought together, who's trying to do something good, but inhabits so many things that have came before him? Or is it the possibility of this color that's coming out of his hands, that sprays into the air to become something new, that falls to the ground, and something that we might not know what will happen in its wake. And I think that tension between the benevolent monster and the openness of color, I think is something that is rich to our time and rich to the possibilities of what American art can be. So thank you very much.
David, we are so grateful for your presentation, and what really struck me is that not only have you taken us on a tour of art history, you've also managed to share who you are and how you think about art, and it's a gift. It's really a gift. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really. I'm going to steal the first question because I would like you to tell us a little bit more about the Tang Wing, what your experiences have been, and maybe if there's a little tension at some certain points between architecture and the art that you're putting in it, but also the personal relationships that you've been navigating, and anything else you might want to share with us.
It's a Friday night. I'll give you some dirt, part of the project. So here the project is, and this is the entire campus of the Met, which, as you know, is a sprawling entity in Central Park between about 81st and 86th Street. So this is our wing. We're in the southwest corner of the park. And I think there's been a road before the Frida Escobedo project, which some people might be familiar with. There was actually a whole other architectural competition. It was awarded to another architect. COVID came. Those plans were scrapped. There was budgets, as they do, ran over. There was a rethinking. There was a new competition. Frida Escobedo, the great Mexico City-based architect, was hired to do the project. And she came in with a real challenge. You're in one of the most beloved places in New York City, in Central Park. You're within an institution that people have very strong feelings about the Met. And some of the questions that I get asked all the time is, you have MoMA, you have Whitney, you have the Guggenheim, you have the Jewish Museum, you have Cooper Hewitt, name it, the new museum. Why do you need to do modern contemporary art? I have a good answer for that, which we can get to later. But it's a big question for people. And she couldn't go 1 inch into Central Park. She needed to double the amount of square footage that we have for galleries to 35 to 70,000 square feet of gallery spaces, which, just to make it physical, the Whitney Museum, the new museum, has 55,000 square feet of gallery, so it's a massive undertaking. But you also couldn't go any higher than the next tallest part of the Met. You also needed to connect to the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Galleries, the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing, the European Painting Galleries. I mean, if I were Frida Escobedo, I would have been like, good luck, I'll do something, I'll find something else to do. And the number of constituents are huge. But I think what she has done, I think very elegantly, is think art first. Think artist first in a way that is really, as Amanda mentioned, Annie Albers is someone she talks about all the time. So when she thinks about influences, she's not saying, I want to be the next Peter Zumthor and make an incredible architectural statement. She's saying, I want to make an incredible building that's great for art and the community that will use it and see it. This lattice that Amanda mentioned, the celicea is what she talks about it, is also a way to soften the impression from the exterior so that those who love the park can still love the park and not hate us or her for doing this intervention into it. And I think what she's done, I think in a way that retains something that's beautiful about the Met, is that she's challenged and provoked what it can be, but also has not forgotten that there's a long history here. And if you kind of break from that too radically, you forget that you're a part of that. Even if you want to change it, even if you want to swerve from it or deviate from it, there's a part of bringing yourself along and enmeshing yourself, like weaving, this is the metaphor she always uses, into part of that history. So she's in, this is the outside of the building. She knew that there were certain things that she had to do and that we wanted her to do, which is bring along the great outdoor spaces that we have the 2 terraces. We only have 1 now. But Central Park was very clear that they don't want people to be visible from the park. So she had to design the wing in a way so that you could have this incredible experience while in the building, but not being seen and having the human presence disturb what that could be like. In some ways, the master plan for the Met Museum is not that old. It was from the 1970s. And the wing that we're replacing, the Wallace wing, isn't that old. It was completed in 1987. But the thing that's extremely interesting is that even Kevin Roche's son, the architect who designed the wing, said that it's not his father's most successful effort. And there wasn't really the hands-on approach that the museum took to what these galleries could be. So, for example, if you've been there, you see that there's not a lot of sculpture because the galleries weren't designed to be hospitable to sculpture. There are rugs, there's carpeting, so that you didn't collect that work. Or there's so much natural light in other parts that we can't show works on paper or different ways of working with the collection. So Frida, from the get-go, wasn't only meeting with me and the other curators who have a billion ideas of what to do. She was meeting with the conservators. She was meeting with neighbors who would see and live with the building and the project. And she was also working very closely with the buildings and team who would actually be responsible for maintaining the work. One thing that she's always put forward, too, is her way of thinking is she's informed by Latin America and the indigenous ways of working there, but she's also a diehard modernist. She loves Mies van der Rohe, she loves Corbusier. How do you bring these cultures in dialogue? Because they are in dialogue. And I think that's also, an incredible job when an architect can do it. When you see oneself as a mediator, as kind of a bridge, or in her words, using Annie Alberts, as someone who can weave different histories and time together.
And I think this is the opportunity we get to open up for questions, just a couple. We can start in this gallery and then move next door. So does anyone have any questions? Just raise your hand on Americanness, American art history. It's interweaving into the new Tang wing. Don't be shy. No one? Anyone next door?
Don't be shy.
Oh, far back. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Hi. Oh, there you are. Hi. I was interested to know that you have a Marsden Hartley in your office. I'm a retired curator of American art here in Maine, and we are rethinking things, but why would someone in New York want Marsden Hartley in their office? And what do you think about him in terms of being an American artist?
Thank you for that question. Part of it is because I love Maine, and I like to be reminded that it exists when in my office banging my head against an email. Part of it is he's a singular painter. He's just an incredible, I have this painting of Mount Katahdin, and I can just see it in my mind's eye, where you see how he articulates a lip of water with just one stroke of white. And I love how he is someone, and I think this is very apt to today, who doesn't see that there's necessarily a bifurcation between abstraction and figuration. And I think you see that a lot in contemporary art. You're a figurative painter, you're an abstract painter. You see this in Nicole's work. There doesn't need to be this hard line between the two. I think this almost becomes almost a ideological position that you're either in one camp or another. I think Hartley was someone who very innately, because maybe the openness of his personality, maybe the experiences that he brought to painting, wanted there to be a possibility of a rapprochement between cultures and places and ways of working. So for me, having that painting is a nice reminder that this other place that I love exists, but also that there doesn't necessarily need to be one way to work, and that artists are the best example of thinking across what maybe too many curators or art historians try to make as firm boundaries and lines. I started off this presentation with the portrait of a German officer because I think that painting and the series of works that he did also made me always sensitive to the fact that the personal history of the artist, even though, I mean, when I was in graduate school, the idea that you would talk about biography in art was like, oh my God, why would you do that? For me, there's no avoiding biography. And I think when I look at Hartley and the different lives that he brought, from being in Europe to being in New York to being in Maine, is so important. So it's also a reminder to me to think of the person of the artist, not just the stuff that she or he makes.
Well, I'm sold. I'll get a Hartley from my office as well.
You have a couple. Yeah.
Oh. So I'm wondering how the Tang family got involved with this project.
Yeah. Oscar Tang has been on the board for, I want to say, almost 30 years, so he's had a long involvement with the museum. But his collecting interests have been more in Asian art. Agnes, who is a great anthropologist and archaeologist, collects broadly also in Asian art, but also in Indigenous American art. It was really during COVID and during the time when there was a lot of anti-Asian hate and aggression that they specifically wanted to step forward to show the extremely positive ways that Asian Americans have impacted American culture. So that was their way of stepping forward and getting involved in the project. They love New York City. They love the Met. But in some ways, the art for them is interesting, but they want to support the people and what's going to make the Met a better place. And it was also very much a part of this wanting to represent a larger community through the project. And I think that was extremely motivating for other people to get on board, because it didn't have to be, you collect this, I want to be involved, or you might be able to host my collection, I want to be involved. They gave an opening to the idea that this project was important for the Met and for New York City, which is something that is, I mean, I feel very lucky to be a part of it that way. There are a number of people who are supporting the project that don't collect modern contemporary art, but see this as a part of being able to make other things happen in the museum. So, for example, this project also permits us with more gallery space to do more collaboration between departments. Right now, we can't do as much that we would want to put collections of the Asian art or Greek and Roman together with modern contemporary art, and that's what we want to do. But I think even more importantly, my hope is that once you go through the new wing and you go out through Greek and Roman or Asian art or European painting, you look at those works as having been contemporary once, right? Everything was made by someone. Everything had a set of conditions it was made in. And while our contemporary moment is different than that, I hope that idea of like the privileging that the maker's time, this project can like really energize and revivify. And I think that's what the Tang saw, that this is in some ways something that helps the narrative of the entire museum. And to go to like my sales pitch earlier of like, why do we need this? That the Met, MoMA does something incredible, Whitney does something incredible, but no one can connect contemporary art to 5,000 years of art history. You can come to our museum and see something that spans that time. I mean, I remember as a graduate student, I would walk through those galleries and always see other artists looking at things that they loved and cared about, but maybe not thinking that they would see their own work there. And I think that's changed through the work of a lot of great curators that have come before me. But I think the new wing permits that to be even more kind of more embodied, that this is an artist museum. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, one more question.
I'll go in the doorway. very nervous to ask this question in
Okay.
particular. Given the time that we're living in, there's so much going on in the social area. What are you seeing in contemporary art, and what do you think will happen with art in the age of the current environment of censorship
Yeah.
with NPR, and
Yep.
how will the museum deal with that?
I think it's a great question. I think it's a very important question. I see what friends and colleagues are dealing with who work for Smithsonian museums. My biggest fear in some ways is questions of censorship, but I think my biggest one is self-censoring, that you don't even get to the point of being told you can't do something because you already internalize that something might be too risky or problematic, or you don't want to bring it to your board or your boss. I think that's a real possibility and a real threat. So, and I don't have an answer for it because it is very real. I mean, there's possible ramifications on your tax status. There are possible ramifications on how your institution is discussed or made an example of. But I do think, and I hope this is the case, that you have fantastic artists, a number of whom that in some ways I want to present today, who have risked a lot personally. Think of David Wojnarowicz, you think of Robert Gober, you think of the Art Workers Coalition, to do that work. And I think that there's a responsibility for museum professionals like myself to not let other people always hold the bag. So I think it's going to take let's see how we do. Luckily, I haven't been there yet. I have complete sympathy for anyone who has to think about losing her job or a grant because of a project that they want to do. But I think that artists are still making important work. And if we want to stay relevant, we need to stay with the artists. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks everyone.